Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's that time again. I'm Menopause Taylor, bringing you the state of menopause in the world today. And it's time to talk more about heart attacks. If you're thinking heart attacks, this is a channel on menopause. Then you're way behind, because heart attacks are the biggest killer of menopausal women. And I want to do everything I can do to make sure you know how to prevent a heart attack. So this podcast is the 16th podcast on heart attacks. I started this 16 podcasts ago. And last week, I told you about all the vitamins, minerals, and supplements that can reduce your risk of a heart attack. And one of them was calcium. And every time I present calcium as a means of helping to prevent a heart attack, someone always asks, what about coronary artery calcium? Doesn't that make calcium bad for your heart? So this podcast is all about coronary artery calcium. You see, I try to anticipate all your questions in advance. I'm always thinking ahead, and I try to create educational products, whether it's a video or a podcast or whatever, in just the right order to answer all your questions, hopefully before you even have to ask them. And if you watch my videos in order, or listen to my podcast in order, or do whatever you do with this education in order, starting at the very beginning, you'll see that I make things really easy for you. So, if you're at higher risk for a heart attack than you'd like to be, and you would like to reduce your risk for a heart attack, or if you just want to understand about the role of calcium in your heart, you should listen to this podcast. Now, in previous podcasts, I have taught you that heart attacks are caused by a buildup of fats in your heart arteries that create a roadblock that prevents blood and oxygen from reaching your heart. It's a lot like a hose that gets a kink in it. So, the fat isn't the only component of the stuff that clogs your arteries, though. That roadblock usually consists of two separate things: fat and calcium. There's a special name for fat and calcium when they exist together in your arteries, and it's called plaque. Plaque starts out soft and waxy, kind of like, imagine Play-Doh, soft, brand new Play-Doh. But if you leave Play-Doh out for a while, it starts getting hard. It starts drying, right? And it's the calcium that makes it hard. That's why we have the term hardening of the arteries. So your arteries have calcium in them, which is what makes them hard. And when women hear that there's something called coronary artery calcium, they assume that taking calcium is bad for their hearts. But it isn't. You see, they confuse the calcium that is important for proper electrical activity of your heart with the calcium that combines with fat to form plaque in your arteries. So let's talk about the difference between the two and the significance of hard calcium plaques in your arteries. In the last podcast, I told you that you need 400 to 1200 milligrams of calcium daily for maintaining the electrical activity of your heart. And that calcium needs to come from either your diet or from supplements. Nothing about what we discussed today changes what you learned in the last podcast. The calcium you ingest from your diet or from supplements does not end up in your heart arteries. The calcium that ends up in your heart arteries is plaque calcium, and it's a product of aging, not ingesting. So here's what happens. Most of the calcium you ingest gets dissolved in your blood. Less than 1% of it can remain undissolved. When it does remain undissolved, it gets filtered through your kidneys. That's what kidney stones are, undissolved calcium. But the calcium that collects in plaque is a result of aging. You see, as we age, we get calcium deposits in many parts of our bodies. Some women have calcium deposits in their breasts. And those don't get there as a result of ingesting calcium any more than the calcium in arterial plaque does. So to some degree, calcification of your arteries and other things is a part of aging. But here's the catch. Calcification in your arteries is a reflection of how much fat is in your arteries. In other words, it's a way of measuring the fats that cause roadblocks in your arteries. And the reason anyone focuses at all on the calcium in your arteries is simply because calcium is easy to see on x-rays, but you can't see fat on x-rays. So the calcium is merely a tool to help define the severity of the fat buildup in your arteries. So there are a bunch of names for the tests that measure how much calcium you have in your arteries. And while they all have names that mention calcium, it's really not the calcium that's the problem, it's the fat. Here's an analogy. Let's say McDonald's wants to know how much soda pop their customers are drinking. Or, more accurately, McDonald's really wants to know how much soda pop their customers are buying. Well, the easiest thing for McDonald's to do in order to get that information is to just count the number of cups they use. They aren't concerned with the cups themselves. They're concerned with what the cups represent. The cups represent soda pop sales, and they're concerned with soda pop sales. But since the number of cups used is a good indicator of soda pop sales, they focus on the cups. That's how it is with assessing the quantity of calcium in your heart arteries. It's really not about the calcium itself. It's about the fat buildup. The degree of fat buildup determines your risk for a heart attack. But it's easier to assess calcium than it is to assess fat. So here are some of the names of the tests that assess how much calcium you have in your heart arteries. And your heart arteries are called coronary arteries. So there's coronary artery calcium, coronary calcium scan, coronary calcium score, calcium scan test, cardiac CT for calcium scoring, and heart scan. They're all the same thing. And they're all looking for calcium that is mixed in with the fat in your arteries simply because it's easier to see the calcium than it is to see the fat. Okay, so you might ask if the calcium has any significance at all. Well, it does. The calcium reflects how hard your arteries are. The harder your arteries, the higher your risk for a heart attack. Going back to my Play-Doh example, if you used very soft, brand new, super soft Play-Doh, it would have very little calcium. And as it starts drying, it would have a little more calcium and be a little harder. And if you let it get rock hard, the calcium score would be very, very high. And along with how hard each of those Play-Doh samples is, the risk of heart attack would increase accordingly. So soft Play-Doh would represent a low risk. Medium would be medium risk. And the hard one, super hard, rock hard, would be high risk. So the quantity of calcium in your heart arteries is merely another measure of how high your risk is for a heart attack. Now, in a previous podcast, I discussed risk calculators for a heart attack. You see, there are so many things like this these days. People like to have numbers associated with just about everything. We've got Fitbits counting your steps. We've got grading systems for malignant tumors. We even have a scale from 1 to 10 for assessing how hot a person is. For some people, having a number is more meaningful than just having facts or words. So all these tests that designate how much calcium you have in your arteries give you a score to determine your risk. But it's really no different than looking at the long list of risk factors for a heart attack. The purpose of the list is for you to determine how many of the risk factors apply to you. The more you have, the higher your risk. But for some people, a list just isn't enough. They may not acknowledge that some of the risk factors apply to them, or the risk factors may not be enough to compel them to change their diet and lifestyle or to take a medication. For them, a numerical coronary artery calcium score may be more meaningful. So when or if you ever get a coronary artery calcium score, here is how you interpret it. Each score translates into how high your risk is for a heart attack. And there are risk levels. A coronary calcium score of 0 is very low risk, and it means that you have a less than 5% likelihood of having a heart attack in the next 3 to 5 years. A coronary calcium score between 1 and 10 is low risk. That means you have less than a 10% likelihood of having a heart attack in the next 3 to 5 years. A coronary calcium score of 11 to 100 is still low risk. It means you have a 10 to 30% likelihood of having a heart attack in the next 3 to 5 years. A coronary calcium score of 101 to 400 is moderate risk. That gives you a 30 to 50% likelihood of a heart attack in the next 3 to 5 years. And a coronary calcium score above 400 is high risk. That puts you at greater than 50% likelihood of having a heart attack in the next 3 to 5 years. And studies do show that women who take HRT tend to have lower coronary calcium scores than those who don't. And this makes sense given the fact that loss of estrogen is what causes your arteries to start aging. It also makes sense given the fact that it's the loss of estrogen that causes hardening of the arteries. And hardening of the arteries is aging of the arteries. So you don't need to know your coronary score to know whether or not you're at risk. But how do you decide? How do you decide if you need a coronary calcium score? You know, it really depends on you. If the list of risk factors tells you what you need to know, then you don't need a coronary calcium score. If you need more proof of your risk, then maybe you do need one. If you have some degree of risk but are uncertain of the best treatment, and a coronary calcium will help determine your treatment, then maybe you need one. But you should only get this or any other test when there's a clear benefit to getting it. If a coronary calcium score will not provide any useful information, skip it. You might have insurance that will not give you lipid-lowering drugs unless you have a coronary artery calcium score. In that case, you may need to get one in order to get the medication you need in order to reduce your risk of a heart attack. And you know how I'm always telling you that you have to weigh the benefit against the risk? Well, this is no different. Coronary artery calcium tests do involve some radiation. It's not high-dose radiation like radiation therapy. It's the quantity of radiation you would normally be exposed to over an entire year. But still, here are some of the reasons you